We're live. Hey everyone. Hope you had a good week. Welcome back to This Week at Work, where we bring you the latest trending news on organizations, technology, and the future of work. I'm Chris Rainey. I'm always joined by my partner in crime, Matt Burns. How are you, my friend?
I'm almost entirely moved in. Life is good.
What have you done anything yet? Like any decorating and stuff like that, or just unpacking still?
Oh, there's some pictures that have been hung. Yeah. I mean, half the place is decorated. The home office, which will be double as the studio for this, still in progress, but we're making steady progress.
Nice. Good to hear. Good to hear. So today's episode, as you can see by the title, we're going to talk about why diverse leaders make better workplaces. And before given the current events in the UK, we'll kick off there. But before we jump into that, there's a growing recognition of how critical diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging is in business performance. In fact, a full 2/3 of the 10,000 leaders that were surveyed as part of Deloitte's recent Global Human Capital Trend Report cited diversity and inclusion as important or very important to business. I would hope so. So good to see it in the report. And with the recent appointment of Rishi Sunak in the UK, we wanted to take the opportunity to discuss its impacts on the UK and beyond. His appointment sheds light on the topic of diversity and inclusion in three notable ways. One, he's the son of immigrants. His parents came to the UK from East Africa, and they're both of Indian origin. Two, he'll be Britain's youngest leader in over 200 years. And lastly, he's the country's first non-white prime minister. So definitely a moment to remember. Matt, let me come to you on this first. What are the impacts to the business, to the government, and how does his appointment affect organizations? What impact, I suppose, do diverse leaders have on organizational performance?
It's a really good question. And it's one that bears repeating, both the question and the answer, because there seemingly is still a disconnect between what we know to be true and how things are actually showing up on corporate boards and at boardroom tables. The Deloitte study painted a pretty clear picture, Chris. 22% lower turnover rates, 27% higher productivity, and 39% higher satisfaction for organizations that were seen as inclusive, diverse, equitable businesses. So it's not just a matter of doing the right thing, although that should be enough. It's also really smart business practices to talk about why diversity is important in a business context.
No, definitely. It's one of those things where in the past it was of a nice to have, a fluffy topic, but when you look at innovation in organizations, when it comes to diversity of leadership, you see those companies really shine, right?
Well, I think here's what I point out. Most organizations that we speak with are going through some form of transformation. Mm-hmm. Cultural transformation, digital transformation, maybe a merger or an acquisition, a divestiture, any number of aspects. But I haven't talked to a leader in an organization in the last 3 years who isn't going through some form of transformation. We also know that transformation is hard. Most organizations don't do it very well. They grit their way through it, or they bully their way through it. And along the way, who pays the consequence? Customers and their employees. And some organizations actually never successfully transform, and they end up not existing. And we're going to see that show up a lot in the next coming years as companies have to increase the rate of change. In a lot of cases, they weren't good at it before the pandemic. But here's the cool thing about diversity. When you have a diverse, inclusive workforce, transformation actually gets a lot easier. When you can pull from different points of view, different backgrounds, different experiences, you're able to bring that collective aggregate expertise to bear. And that ultimately drives stronger, more cohesive transformations when you bring people with you along the journey. This is change management 101, Chris. When you bring people with you along the journey, transformations are ultimately much more successful. So that just one more business case to add to the pile. Diversity and inclusion, equity and belonging, these are all early indicators of successful transformation.
Amazing. Just checking with our producer. Have we been bringing up the slides on the screen? Yeah, amazing. Just to make sure we had those there. I can't see them on my end for some reason, but Any questions in the chat so far? No. Leave your things in the chat. Well, let's jump into some of those slides though, Matt. Right? The case for an inclusive culture: 2 times more likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 3 times likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be an innovative, agile organization, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes.
Yeah. The evidence is really like
we'll just end the show there. Yeah, that's it.
If we were talking about corporate finance right now, this wouldn't be a discussion. This would be the business case for whatever was on the other end of that requirement. But because we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and that butts up against not only business principles, but also, Chris, the uncomfortable part of this is it butts up against personal biases and personal values and history. In a lot of cases, those are much harder to break than simply doing a mathematical formula to arrive at a strong business case for something. We know that there's business cases for things that we aren't doing. I mean, Chris, most of us know that if we simply eat less calories than we burn, we'll lose weight. But yet obesity is rising across most of the Western world right now. So like there's a disconnect between what we know and what we put action to. But in this particular case, it couldn't be more important to reinforce the principles of this if we're going to have successful, healthy companies. Chris, to say nothing of the fact we're talking about a shrinking workforce. You and I have talked about offline. The demographics in this world are changing. I love demographics because it's the most nonpartisan way of predicting the future because it's just numbers. We know the population will age. Somebody who is 50 today will be 60 10 years from now. Like it's pretty easy to make that correlation. And we know that there's more baby boomers leaving the workforce over the next 15 years than there are people to take up their spots. We also know that the workforce is dramatically shifting its skill sets, that traditionally those, traditional, Chris, those blue collar manufacturing jobs in the service sector, jobs in retail, restaurants, heck, even jobs in corporate finance that required people to do them are being either automated or made redundant altogether with AI and with technology and with big data. So the workforce is going through a massive transformation at a time when I don't know that we would say we've done a good job, societally speaking, of building the skills necessary to have success in this new world. So we're seeing this big deficit of talent. If you want to keep people engaged, if you want people to invest their time in their own development, but that's ultimately in service to your firm's growth and their success, you have to be inclusive. You have to have diverse teams. You have to be willing to try something that is different than perhaps what you tried before. It's just simply not good enough to be on Wall Street and say, I'm only going to hire grads from MIT and Harvard. Like you have to be more inclusive with your practices if you're going to get good business results, but also to increasingly compete in a shrinking talent pool.
I don't think anyone listening will disagree with what we're saying. I think the big challenge is, how can those leaders actually make those insights practical in their organization? I think that's the real challenge, right?
Yeah, it's making practical, and it's understanding the resistance points in the organization and where it butts up against. I mean, Chris, I was at an event yesterday here in Ottawa, and a big topic of conversation was new legislation that was introduced that requires employers of greater than 25 employees. So if you're a company with 25 or more employees, you have to disclose what is your electronic monitoring policy. Something we've been talking about the last several weeks, you and I. And This is very, very clear. You have to put publicly, to be transparent, what is your practices about how you monitor your employees electronically. There's lots of companies right now that are not being transparent about that and that are taking trust the opposite direction and not extending trust to their employees. So there's some resistance across a number of fronts. The business world is fundamentally changing. We're reinventing the traditional 5-day work week. We're shifting priorities. Work-life balance has been replaced by work-life integration. Like there's lots of things that are happening. There's never been this many remote jobs, never been this many hybrid jobs. It's a shifting landscape. And yes, there's going to be pain in the background. And yes, there'll be people that resist the shift. But I think it's fair to say the train has left the station. We're going down this path. The question is, how far do we go down the path and how fast? And I think, Chris, you're right to point out that there's a practicality element to this that goes beyond simply measuring quotas. Like it's not just simply not good enough to say, hey, we've hit our quota. We're now a diverse, inclusive, and equitable business. Like that's just not, you have to be thoughtful about the integration of those practices. And you have to give those people who are diversely representative of your community the opportunity to influence policy, to influence strategy, to influence programming. That's when you become a truly diverse business. And I think, Chris, that's where the rubber hits the road, is you need to extend beyond simply hitting a quota and ask yourselves, have we put this particular lens on hiring? Have we looked at our job postings to make sure the language isn't more masculine than feminine and doesn't discount a number of people who would be applying in the process? Is it non-binary at all? Like, are we thinking about the practical elements? And I get that's kind of like administrivia, and HR people might be saying, hey, we want to be moving up the ladder to more strategic conversations. And I'm with you. I want to be there alongside of that. And we have to make sure we do the basics as well. And if it's a good practice to run your organization through an exercise to do job posting review as a teaching tool to explain why diversity and inclusion is important and how there's a very real business impact in not doing it well, then start there. And if you're past that point, then it's about maybe having a different conversation about the tools and the resources you have in your organization.
No, I agree. I think it's funny because one of the things that really stood out to me in the report as well was also the 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader, especially after last week's chat when we was talking about power skills. If we could bring that up on screen. So you've got curiosity, which I love there, because different ideas and experiences enable the growth in organizations. You've got a cultural intelligence. That was an interesting one, because cultural intelligence, because not everyone sees the world through the same cultural frame. So I actually love that one.
Let me just jump in on cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence doesn't mean you know everything about every culture.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
It actually means that you know very little about other cultures, and you accept the fact that you need to be more empathetic. You need to listen more. You might have to course correct what you're doing because it's not culturally appropriate for this audience. So I just want to put that out there. That's a key point. Cultural intelligence might sound, artificially aspirational. It's about knowing your own limitations and then building that level of curiosity and resilience and empathy into your approach so that you can demonstrate more intelligence around cultures.
Which of those kind of 5 areas stood out to you, Matt, when you had a look at it?
Collaborative to me felt very different.
Sorry, 6, apologies, by the way.
I think collaborative to me felt different. I think the previous way, the world in which I grew up in a corporate world, your role was to make your boss look good.
Yeah.
That was the job. And if you didn't make your boss look good, it didn't help your career. And there was very much information was treated as a weapon. So you'd pass information to somebody else who'd pass information to somebody else who'd pass and every stage along the way, it's getting another layer of like politics and bureaucracy, and people are, different interests are being in. You might give them a number, and the story that's told 5 links down the chain might be this wildly inappropriate story, but it started with a number. And now it's shifted to where information has been democratized, and leaders are more facilitators of success. They're less gatekeepers of informations and decisions. So I think for me, the collaborative piece was really, really key, because it's not only good practice in the context of a diverse, equitable, inclusive workforce, it's now just management practices 101. If you're going to lead in a remote or a hybrid environment with knowledge-based workers, you have to facilitate their success. It has to go beyond just simply accountabilities and providing limited information, keeping people in the dark. It's got to go beyond that.
It's kind of flipped, right? In the past, it was leaders were very much like talent hoarders, and now they're really now a talent enablers, and that's. But I think many organizations haven't shifted the way that's structured, or even the way it's compensated in businesses.
And that compensated piece, I think, is a really key point. We have to be mindful that humans are subject to incentives. We will naturally move towards the direction in which we're incentivized. So if we're incentivized, let's just use a sales example, Chris. If your sales team is individually recognized, so they have individual quotas, individual targets, they're going to do their absolute best to hit their individual targets. Where the opportunity might exist, probably not in your team, but in other sales teams, is they might have success, but they may not care about their teammates' success because they're not actually financially incentivized for their colleague to have success. So they may actually hoard deals or hoard relationships or things of that nature. Unless you build a level of incentive into your plans that includes teamwork and collaboration and culture, they're not financially motivated. And in the case of sales roles, we know sales professionals are very heavily financially motivated. That might spring off 2nd and 3rd degree behaviors that may not be what you actually want. So aligning your incentive to this, like we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and in compensation in the same conversation, because that's the level of inclusion you need to have in these principles that needs to permeate through the entire organization.
Yeah, you literally described 10 years of my career working in a sales team where every single salesperson was incentivized to work against each other for individual sales targets as opposed to the collective. And you had not just hoarding those things, but also hoarding information. And so you don't even have that knowledge exchange. And you also don't get that diversity of thought and perspective as well that we're talking about, because people aren't sharing. One of the things that I loved in this, which I didn't expect, was the courage piece as well, because talking about as it says, imperfections involves personal risk taking. I never really thought of that, if I'm being honest, as a trait of an inclusive leader. Is that something that would have kind of came to your top of your mind?
No, but I love it. And I love it because I, like you, can go back to stories in my background where I remember sending an email to somebody and there was a typo in it. And my boss at the time came running down the hall and we had to have a conversation about a typo in an email. I look back and go what are we doing? Why? Sorry, I won't put in, I'm actually a pretty good writer. I don't usually make errors. I won't make another error again. It was 22 or 23. It was just, but that was a level of fear in that organization that permeated, where a mistake came with a consequence. So it wasn't just this leader themselves wasn't actually a bad leader, but the culture of the organization was errors lead to consequences. Consequences lead to real life impacts. So you can't make any mistakes. And in that case, Chris, not only do you spend lots of time managing politics and bureaucracy, but your innovation becomes next to zero, because nobody wants to put their hand up and say anything different, because they might have the wrath of somebody who may not agree with them.
Yeah, it's funny because literally just before we came live, Bruno published one of our podcasts. I'm going to put him on the spot now. And it made no sense, the title. And it was live on YouTube, live on all of our podcast platforms. I was like, Bruno, you should probably change that on there.
I'm trembling.
Yeah, because I'm quitting, I'm leaving as well. No, but you're right. We have to encourage people to fail forward, and I love organizations that almost celebrate that. Just as important as the successes is the almost as well, because to all the points you made.
Well, and here's the beautiful thing about today's world is that we collectively as society actually don't like things that look overly polished and professional and perfect. We actually want a bit of authenticity in it. I mean, reality TV spun off a whole generation of people that want to see the flaws of other people. So as long as you do a job, and this applies, by the way, in the corporate world, Chris, this was one of my biggest tricks as a CHRO, was I would make sure that I would socialize a result that was half as good as I expected every time. Set the bar exceptionally low, whether it was a business case, whether it was a company program and adoption and participation rates, whether it was the time it would take to finish a project. I would always build a bit of buffer into my estimates so that I was never having to achieve the bar that was set, because in those cases, I set it up so that we could exceed that bar, and the psychology was different, that, oh, wow, your team actually doubled performance over what we thought. That's fantastic, versus coming out the gate saying we're going to achieve the absolute max capacity, which in all cases wasn't necessarily possible, and setting my team up for failure in this case to have to hit these targets. So I think we're now in a world where if you socialize in advance, hey, we're going to make mistakes along the way, we're going to learn, we want your feedback, we're going to make some bumps along the road, people are much more appreciative of that than the closed door, this is perfect, don't ask questions approach, which is ultimately very counter to our current state. So I think that courage piece comes along with the sense of safety. To have courage, you need to feel safe to make mistakes. And I think organizations and leaders can focus in on creating safer workplaces for things like ideas and iterations. But to your point, Chris, it requires us to, if a mistake is made, to not go off the handle because somebody put a typo in an email or there was a title that was incorrect on a YouTube post. It requires us to be more measured in our response. Otherwise, the next time that person undertakes that task, they're going to think twice about that title. They're going to think twice about that email. I never spent as much time worrying about emails as I did that 1 year in that job, because I was so terrified of making a mistake again, because my boss was terrified of me making a mistake. So that's the kind of, that's how quickly culture gets formed in organizations. It starts with things like that. So you need to be very mindful and thoughtful and intentional about what kind of expectations you're setting in your business.
Yeah. So I think the question is, Bruno, are you now terrified of what I said earlier?
Absolutely.
He's terrified. Oh, Matt, I failed you, Matt. I'm sorry.
I can't wait to see the next 10 titles because I know Bruno well enough to know that he's not going to leave. He's just going to make your life miserable.
Exactly. They're going to be the most simple titles of all time. He's not going to be courageous in any way whatsoever. Do you think we're talking about Rishi Sunak in the UK, and do you think there's extra pressure that's on the shoulders of diverse leaders? You see all of a sudden through in the news of all over, and they put there's like this spotlight that if it was a white male leader, no one would even mention it, right? Whereas if it's our first Asian or prime minister of color in 200 years, or I think the stat was, all of a sudden any mistake is kind of scrutinized, and that I also see that play out in the corporate world as well.
Well, I think it's, and I don't want to speak for diverse leaders, but here's what I can offer from a participant point of view, from an observer point of view. We saw this happen with Obama in the United States. When that occurred, that was a significant watershed moment for United States politics. And at the time, there was very real concerns regarding his safety in some cases, because there was a real upswelling of racial tension that came as a result of his ultimately being elected. I don't know that I anticipate that in this case, but what I would say is, for diverse leaders, it would seem like, to your point, they're not having to only do an amazing job with policy in their actual role, but they also have a greater responsibility to a cause, which makes it really difficult to be able to manage that in addition to managing your full-time job. And I completely empathize with that. And I think it actually, depending on mindset, it kind of cuts both ways. Like, it could be seen as a significant weight to carry, a responsibility to carry, or you can see it as an opportunity to advance a conversation that's probably several hundred years overdue. So it really depends on how you structure it. And this, again, comes back to leadership. If the leadership of Mr. Sunak's parliament and government is inclusive and diverse, with high-performing people that are engaged and committed and believe in the collective shared vision that he ultimately co-creates with them, he's going to have a lot of success in very difficult situations. If he doesn't create that culture, it's going to fall apart, as it would with a leader of another racial background. Only the spotlight will be greater on Mr. Sunak just because he is the first at this juncture. So I think that's kind of a long way of answering your question. I'll be curious to see what happens. It's a challenging time in the UK's history.
We've got a question from Roxine, who says that she thinks courage is more about stepping up despite the possibility of backlash from failure. 100%. You can try and then apologize versus not trying and then no. Yeah,
we did. I 100% agree. I think the amount of times I've done that in organizations, and I've sometimes been seen as the troublemaker in a business or going against the grain, but I feel like those moments are scary, they're challenging, they're stressful, but they're probably the most moments in my life that have changed my life as well. I think you have to, because otherwise it's exhausting. I think we've all worked in organizations where if you're part of a culture where that doesn't create that psychological safety where you can speak up, it's just energy draining as well. So I've even spoken to HR executives, and many of them will be listening, that have quit their jobs and said, you know what, this isn't the place I'm going to be. I know that's quite extreme, but if you're going to wake up every day and spend most of your life somewhere, you need to be somewhere that's aligned with your values and your purpose, and that values you for every part of you.
Doubly so when you're in HR, because you're in between senior level decision making and the impact of the employees. So you get a front row seat to the impact of strategic decisions on your employee experience, your employee engagement, your employee development and ongoing growth of the company. I was actually having this chat yesterday with a few HR leaders around the table, and we were talking about this idea of, again, managing and having digital reporting, and along with digital oversight of employees, this digital monitoring policy here in Ontario. And there was very clear beliefs around the table that if their organizations were to implement a policy of electronic monitoring of their employees, they would tender their resignations. So for some people, this is a very significant issue. And, Chris, I look back at my career, and there's a couple of scenarios where I had to go toe to toe with a CEO or a CFO or a board member and make it very clear that this was a line that we could definitely cross, but that I wouldn't be crossing with them. Now, the challenging thing is that not everybody has the privilege to be able to threaten to walk out of a job.
I was going to say that too.
It's a tough time. We're walking into inflationary pressures, recession. Like, I understand that. And I also can give people assurances that if they are in a position to make that kind of decision, that even if the compensation isn't commensurate with what you're making now, you will ultimately feel better in an organization where you have a stronger values alignment, because you'll be excited about coming to work. You'll be excited about contributing. You'll be excited about being a cultural ambassador for your organization. If you hate the place you work and you disagree with the decisions and leadership's values, every email you get is like one more needle poking into you every single time. It's not a pleasant place to be. So it's like, how do you balance that part of it? And again, I get it's privileged to be able to make that decision. I'm just Chris, I'm increasingly seeing, as you are, people making that decision.
I did it myself. I know we don't have much time left, but before I started HR Leaders, I worked in the same company for 10 years. It was bought out by a private equity business. They came in, stripped everything back, cut bonuses, cut, just responsibility. And I kind of found myself sitting in the room with the CEO and COO, and literally, two people that have just walked through the door, and all of a sudden they know more about the business than me. Now, I've been there for 10 years, and I'm trying to, provide my feedback and insight to help them and the organization. And it's like, Chris, you're young, you don't get it. I was already, immediately, oh, okay, here we go. And also, one of them even said to me, I didn't get paid this much when I was your age. Can you imagine hearing that from someone in a meeting when you've been there for 10 years, practically building a business? And I took the extreme version of not just going and leaving the company, but starting my own business. And I can tell you firsthand that Shane and I, we bootstrapped the HR Leaders, and we were on less than 50% of what we were on in that business, which was tough when you've got a mortgage and a baby and live in London. But I can tell you, the next day when I woke up, I had never felt so excited and so full of energy and purpose before, to get up and go out and truly drive something that I really believe in with people that I believe in as well. So yeah, I love this topic. And for everyone, if you're listening live or you're kind of joining later, we'd love to hear all of your thoughts and comments. So please leave them. Me and Matt will get back to them as well. So make sure you leave them in the comment section, whatever platform that you're listening on. I feel like now I want to kind of jump into our HR Spotlight of the Week. So this is kind of a new segment we're doing. The HR technology landscape, or the workplace landscape, to be honest, is evolving so rapidly. It's quite hard to keep up with all of the different technologies and solutions out there. So Matt and I thought that once a week, we'll just kind of spotlight companies that we feel are making some great impact. So for this week, we wanted to highlight Cyan Health, whose mission is to make mental well-being a superpower. It's an amazing organization. They're really focusing on reinventing a workplace mental health and well-being to empower not just individuals, but also creating thriving companies. This has to be both as well. So, if that's something that sounds like is interest to you, you can take a look at their website. They're focused around, self-awareness through robust self-assessments, building resilience with personalized self-care tools. You can chat with a counselor. As someone who suffers from mental health and well-being and from anxiety attacks and anxiety, I know firsthand how important this is. And they've been doing some incredible work with some of my clients and some of Matt's partners as well. So you can connect with their founder. It'll be LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, we'll tag in Vlad, who's one of the founders there. Go check them out as well. So definitely worthwhile. And then we also want to talk about HR Leaders on the Move, Matt. So we want to celebrate the moves of some of our friends. So some of the people we've seen moving new roles, we want to congratulate. So we've got Jeanette Huron, who's now become the Chief People Officer of Gate Group. So congratulations, Jeanette, to you. We've got Lisa Esperanza, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief HR Officer now over at AutoNation. Congratulations, Lisa. Katrin Valeri, who's now the Chief People Officer of Dufay Group. Congratulations, Katrin. And last but not least, we've got Audrey Clegg, who's the Chief Talent Officer at Sanofi. So congrats to all of you on the new roles. You're probably not going to see this. You're going to be so busy working right now. And then lastly, we're going to jump into what we're reading. Do you want to go through that one, Matt? Have you got that in front of you, or do you want me to go ahead with it?
Jump ahead.
Jump ahead. So this week I had the pleasure of interviewing a guy called Daniel Strode, an amazing individual. He's the author of The Culture Advantage, Empowering Your People to Drive Innovation. So it's an amazing book. So in the book, he goes into 8 principles you can use to create a culture of innovation in your company. Quite fitting given what we've just spoken about. So we've linked the link in the chat as well, so you can check that out. So we just want to kind of throw some more resources and both from what we're reading, who we're interviewing, who we're chatting to, who's moving around in the HR space, and anyone else you want to shout out, also shout them out in the chat as well. But I think that's it, Matt, for now. I think,
I would just say if we're crowdsourcing this, Chris. So if you are aware of any HR tech companies that you think you want to spotlight here, let us know. If you're aware of any people, HR leaders on the move, bring us into the fold on that. And then what you're reading. I mean, this is a group exercise. Let's bring this along. We're sharing ours, but we'd love to hear about yours as well.
Also going to launch a weekly newsletter shortly, where we'll be sending that out directly to your LinkedIn inbox with all of the links to all of the resources and everything we speak about. So make sure you do that. And the last thing, if you want to connect with me or connect with Matt, there'll be links in the bio to jump on a call with Matt and connect with me as well. But apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day. Have an amazing weekend, and we'll see you all next week. Bye, everyone. See you later, Matt.
Bye all.
Bye.